The stretch of road leading through Hollow Creek was infamous. Drivers swore the highway had a way of lulling you into a trance, its unending darkness broken only by faint headlights and the occasional street sign. Few dared to drive it alone at night, but Ben didn't have a choice. His shift at the diner ran late, and the quickest way home was through Hollow Creek Highway. The clock on his dashboard read 1:43 a.m. as he turned onto the road. The trees loomed like jagged shadows on either side, their branches clawing at the moonlit sky. His car's headlights seemed to vanish into the blackness ahead. Ben kept the radio off. The silence felt more comforting than static. But as he rounded a bend, he saw something up ahead, a figure standing by the roadside, one arm raised in a half-hearted attempt to hitch a ride. It was a young woman in a pale, tattered dress. Ben slowed, the image of her burning into his mind. Her hair was dark and wild, obscuring her face, but she seemed frail, trembling as though lost. Rolling down the window slightly, he called out, "You okay? Need a ride?" And she nodded without a word and climbed into the back seat. The air inside the car grew icy the moment she sat down. Ben glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face still hidden beneath her hair. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just down the road," she whispered. Her voice was faint, like a breeze brushing against his ear. Ben nodded, focusing on the road. The longer he drove, the heavier the air felt, pressing down on him like a weight. He glanced at the mirror again, and his stomach tightened. Her reflection wasn't there. The back seat was empty. Ben gripped the wheel tighter, refusing to look back. The car's temperature dropped further, his breath visible now in the frigid air. "You're going too fast," her voice whispered, though she was nowhere to be seen. Ben slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a stop. The road was empty again. No sign of her. His chest heaved as he tried to collect himself. "Just my imagination," he muttered, shaking his head. But then he saw it. In the distance, illuminated by his taillights, the figure stood in the middle of the road, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. "You didn't take me home," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally in the silence. Ben's hands fumbled to shift the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered, casting the figure in eerie flashes of light. She was closer now, closer, until her face pressed against his window. Her skin was gray and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as cracks formed across her face, spreading like spider webs. The last thing Ben heard before the world went dark was her whisper, "Now you'll stay forever." The next morning, a passing truck driver found Ben's car abandoned on the side of Hollow Creek Highway. The engine was cold, and the driver's seat was empty. But in the back seat, there was a faint outline of frost, shaped like a figure sitting patiently, waiting for the next driver to come along. Nina hated working the graveyard shift at St. Mark's Hospital. The quietness was unnatural, as if the building itself held its breath. The emergency department would sometimes roar to life with chaos, but the upper floors, especially the abandoned Wing C, were unnervingly still. It was nearing 3 a.m., the witching hour, as her co-workers joked. Nina sat at the nurse's station, finishing a chart. The dim fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the only sound accompanying the rhythmic beeping of distant monitors. Her radio crackled to life. Room 317. A distorted voice said. Nina frowned. That wing had been closed for renovations for months. No one was supposed to be up there. Did someone just call for 317? She asked through the radio. Static. Sighing, she grabbed her flashlight and badge. Probably maintenance messing around, she muttered, trying to reassure herself. Still, her pulse quickened as she made her way to the elevator. The doors opened with a ding, revealing a dark corridor. The air was colder here, the usual hum of life absent. The flashlight beam revealed peeling wallpaper, plastic sheets covering old furniture, and scattered construction tools. "Hello?" Nina called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. She approached room 317, the door ajar. Pushing it open, her flashlight revealed an empty hospital bed, its sheets perfectly tucked. The faint smell of antiseptic lingered. And then, the phone on the wall rang. Nina jumped, her flashlight beam shaking. The sound was impossibly loud, echoing through the desolate wing. She hesitated before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" she whispered. A pause. Then, a rasping voice. "You shouldn't be here." Her stomach turned to ice. She slammed the receiver down and spun around to leave, only to find the corridor completely dark. "Nina!" a voice whispered. She whipped the flashlight around, the beam landing on a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a man in a hospital gown, his face gaunt, eyes sunken into hollow sockets. His lips stretched into an unnatural grin. "Leave!" he hissed, his voice layered as though two people spoke at once. Nina stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. She scrambled to pick it up, the beam cutting through the darkness again, but the figure was gone. She didn't wait. She ran, heart hammering, until she reached the elevator. Jabbing the button repeatedly, she glanced back. The man stood at the far end of the hall, grinning. Slowly, he raised a hand and waved. The elevator doors opened, and Nina threw herself inside. As they closed, she heard the faint ring of the phone. Again. Back at the nurse's station, she tried to tell her co-workers what had happened, but they dismissed it as stress. 317? One said, laughing nervously. That room's been empty for years. The last patient died there after calling for help all night. Nobody answered. Nina didn't finish her shift. She left St. Mark's that night and never returned. But every so often, her old coworkers swear they hear a phone ringing from the abandoned wing. It started with a rumor. Everyone at Oakwood High whispered about the extra student. Teachers swore they always had one more kid on their rosters than they remembered assigning. Attendance sheets would mysteriously have a name no one recognized, Emily Hart. When Kayla transferred to Oakwood, she didn't think much of it. Just another dumb school ghost story, she told herself. But that changed during her second week. It was during homeroom when Kayla noticed the girl. She sat at the very back of the room, hair hanging in her face, scribbling furiously in a notebook. None of the other students paid her any attention. "Who's that?" Kayla whispered to her seatmate, Mia. Mia frowned. "Who?" Kayla pointed, but when she looked again, the desk was empty. That night, Kayla couldn't shake the unease. Her curiosity got the better of her, so she searched the name Emily Hart online. The first hit chilled her to the bone. A news article from 5 years ago. Oakwood teacher arrested after student found dead in classroom. Emily Hart, 16, had been a junior at Oakwood. The article detailed how she had accused Mr. Donovan, a respected teacher, of inappropriate behavior. Days after filing the complaint, she was found dead in his classroom. The investigation ruled it a suicide, but rumors swirled about what really happened. The next day, Kayla couldn't focus. Emily's story gnawed at her, and she started noticing strange things. Books falling off shelves, lockers slamming shut on their own, whispers that seemed to follow her down the hall. Then came the lockdown. The announcement blared unexpectedly during Kayla's history class. "Attention! This is a lockdown. Secure all doors immediately." Mr. Donovan, Kayla's teacher, locked the door with shaky hands. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Is it another drill?" someone asked. I don't know," he muttered. The lights flickered, and then Kayla saw her again. Emily. She stood outside the door, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes dark voids. Her mouth didn't move, but Kayla heard her voice clearly. "He's lying. He did this to me." Kayla's blood ran cold. She turned to the class, but no one else seemed to see Emily. Mr. Donovan was pacing nervously, muttering to himself. The intercom buzzed, static filling the room before a chilling voice cut through. "You can't hide, Mr. Donovan." Mr. Donovan froze. The door handle rattled, then twisted violently, but it stayed locked. Kayla couldn't stay silent anymore. "It's her! Emily!" Everyone turned to look at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Mia asked. Before Kayla could respond, the lights went out completely. In the pitch darkness, a loud bang echoed through the room, followed by a low, guttural whisper, "Justice." When the lights came back on, Mr. Donovan was gone. The door was wide open, and the desk at the back of the room, Emily's desk, was filled again. Her notebook sat on the desk, open to a single haunting sentence. "He paid for what he did, but I'm not finished." Kayla transferred out of Oakwood the next week. No one saw Mr. Donovan again, and no teacher would speak about Emily Hart, but every now and then students swear. They hear her name called during roll, long after her seat has gone empty.
Have you ever heard strange noises, coming from beneath your floorboards, creaks, whisper, and cries that seem to echo in the silence? What if there was something hiding down there? Something far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. Brace yourself for a true story that will make you question what's lurking just out of sight. I thought I had found the perfect house. I should have known better. I've never believed in ghosts, at least I didn't until we moved into the house on Maple Street. It was everything we wanted, big, quiet, and at first, perfectly normal. I remember walking through the door with my wife Lisa and our 2 kids and thinking, this is it. This is home. But that was before the creaks started. Not the normal creaks of a house settling, mind you. These were different. They came at night, when everything should have been still, low, rhythmic, like someone was walking just beneath the floorboards. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the house settling. Old house do that, right? But then there were the cries. It wasn't a normal sound either. At first, it was a faint whimper, like a child calling for their mom in the distance. But as the nights passed, it got worse, louder, more desperate. It wasn't coming from outside either. It was inside the house. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. But each time it happened, my heart would race. Lisa heard it too, but she was more freaked out than I was. One night, after yet another sleepless evening, filled with the sound of crying and creaking, Lisa finally snapped. "We have to go down there," she said, her voice trembling. "Down where?" I asked, though I already knew. "The basement. The noises. They're coming from there." The basement. We hadn't even unpacked all the boxes yet, and I had no desire to go into the dark, musty room below the house, but I wasn't about to let Lisa face it alone. So, we went. The stairs creaked as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, the crying was deafening, close enough to make my skin crawl. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the dark corners of the room. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence was worse than the cries. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A floorboard, out of place, raised slightly on one side. I bent down to inspect it, my hand hovering above the wood. Something was wrong about it. My breath caught as I lifted the board. There, in the darkness beneath the floor, was a hole. A long, narrow hole that went deeper than the length of my arm. And the cries, they were louder now, clearer. It was as if someone, or something, was trapped down there, begging to be freed. Before I could react, a cold, clammy hand shot out of the hole, grabbing my wrist with a grip that felt like death itself. I screamed, but the hand pulled me toward the darkness beneath the floor. I twisted and fought, desperate to break free. Lisa was screaming now too, her voice high and panicked. I felt my body being dragged toward the hole, the AIR growing colder and colder, the cries almost deafening. Just as I was about to be pulled in, I wrenched free, falling backward onto the cold floor. The hand was gone. The cries stopped. We didn't stay another minute. We ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind us. But the worst part, the thing that keeps me awake at night. When we left the house, Lisa found something in the hallway. A small, dusty floorboard, pried up just a little. And from the darkness beneath, we heard it again. "Help me." But it wasn't just the voice of a child. It was my voice. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a white Christmas. Inside the house, the lights twinkled on the tree, casting soft shadows across the walls. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas Eve, the kind of night you'd remember with warmth and nostalgia. But then there came the knock at the door. I glanced at my husband, Rob, as the sound echoed through the quiet house. He frowned, lifting his head from his book. "It's past midnight," he muttered. "Who's knocking at this hour?" I shrugged, feeling uneasy despite the holiday cheer. We weren't expecting anyone. "Maybe it's just some kids, carolers or something," I suggested. Rob raised an eyebrow but didn't move. I stood up, brushing my hair back from my face, and headed to the door. When I opened it, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. A group of people stood on the doorstep, their faces obscured by hoods. They wore tattered, mismatched coats that looked as though they'd been sewn together from old, worn fabric. Their eyes were shadowed, but their presence, cold, unnatural, made my blood run cold. "Merry Christmas," one of them whispered, his voice strangely hollow like an echo bouncing off an empty cavern. But there was no cheer in his tone, no warmth, It was just wrong. I hesitated, feeling a creeping dread crawl up my spine. Thank you. But it's awfully late for carolers, don't you think? Before I could close the door, they began to sing. The first note was low, almost imperceptible, like a breath exhaled into the freezing night. But then it grew louder, too loud for such a small group. And their voices, they didn't harmonize. They were disjointed, like something was pulling them in different directions, out of sync with each other. The words of the carol sounded garbled, distorted, as if they were singing through layers of thick fog. Rob stepped up behind me, peering over my shoulder at the strange figures. "Let's just go inside," he said, his voice tight with unease. But something made me linger. A strange compulsion. I couldn't stop staring at them. Their singing grew more intense, more frantic, and I began to feel a coldness in the air, a presence that wasn't there before. As their song wavered, the temperature in the house dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The night was silent, and in that silence, the ground seemed to tremble. It wasn't a sound that I could hear, but a vibration, a deep hum that vibrated through my chest and bones. I looked back at Rob, his face pale, eyes wide. "Close the door," he whispered urgently. "Now." I slammed the door shut and bolted it, but the dread didn't leave. We stood in the living room, staring at each other in the dark, the faintest echoes of that terrible carol still ringing in my ears. The clock on the wall ticked. 1 minute passed, then 2. Suddenly, the knock came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. It rattled the door, shaking the frame. I froze. "Don't answer it," Rob said, voice shaking. "Whatever they are, they're not human." I turned to him, terror seizing my throat. "What if they—" But before I could finish, the door handle rattled. Slowly, as if someone was trying to get in. The house grew colder, the air thickened. Then a voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered from the dark. "You've been bad this year." I didn't dare open the door again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. As the minutes stretched on, I wondered if the singing was still out there, waiting, watching. And perhaps, just perhaps, it hadn't been the carolers at all. What if they were still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the night would fall silent again? What if they came back, next Christmas?
The Thompson family always gathered at Grandma Edith's house for Thanksgiving. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. The house, an old Victorian, perched on a hill at the edge of town, had a history that stretched back nearly a century. The creaky floors, the dusty furniture, the faded portraits on the walls. It all held the weight of generations past. But it wasn't just the house that made Thanksgiving special. It was Grandma Edith herself, the heart of the family. This year, however, felt different. There was an unusual chill in the air, a heaviness that hung over the table, making the usual joy of the holiday seem hollow. Even the crackling fire in the hearth couldn't chase it away. Grandma Edith was quieter than usual. Her once sharp eyes, which had always sparkled with warmth and wit, were cloudy, distant, as the family sat around the table, the steam rising from the bowls of turkey and mashed potatoes. She simply stared into the fire, murmuring to herself, "Grandma, are you all right?" Her granddaughter, Emily, asked hesitantly, sitting beside her. Grandma Edith blinked, as though coming out of a trance. "Oh, yes, dear," she said with a forced smile. "Just thinking about the old days when we used to pray before the meal." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. clasped tightly together in her lap. Emily glanced around the table. Her parents, aunts, uncles, all seemed to notice the change in the air, but were too polite, or perhaps too uncomfortable, to mention it. They knew Grandma Edith had been growing more forgetful lately, but there was something about her today that felt off. "Well, it's about time we said grace," Emily's father, David, said, clearing his throat. He motioned for everyone to join hands. As the family gathered together, their hands cold and stiff in each other's grips, Grandma Edith slowly raised her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, almost a whisper. The room fell silent, the sound of the fire crackling the only noise. "Lord," she began, her voice steady, but somehow wrong, too steady, as though it had been rehearsed. "We thank you for this meal, for the bounty you have provided, for the hands that prepared it, and for the hands that shall prepare it." She paused, her eyes flickering briefly toward the darkened corner of the room, where no one was standing. David glanced at his wife, confused. "Mom, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice nervous now. Grandma Edith ignored him and continued, her voice growing more fervent. "We thank you for the harvest of souls, for the warmth that fills this house, and for the hunger that brings us together, for the family, and for the one who will join us tonight, and forevermore." The words hung heavy in the air, and the flames in the hearth flickered violently, as if reacting to her words. The family looked at each other, uncomfortable. Emily shifted uneasily in her seat, her grip on her mother's hand tightening. "Mom?" "Stop," David said, his voice shaking now. "This isn't funny. This isn't how we pray. What's going on?" But Grandma Edith didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, her lips curled into a strange smile. "The feast has been prepared. The table is set. All are welcome, even those who were once lost." Suddenly, the room grew colder. A heavy weight seemed to press down on them, and the air was thick, suffocating. David felt a chill run up his spine, and his eyes flicked toward the front door, half expecting someone or something to be standing there. But no one was. Grandma Edith's voice grew louder, almost chanting now. "We give thanks for the feast. We give thanks for the feast of what has been taken, and what shall be taken again." Then there was a sound, a faint scratching, as though something was clawing at the window. It was so soft, so subtle, that no one could quite place it, but the longer it persisted, the more unsettling it became. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. I don't feel good," she said, her voice trembling. "I need some air." Before anyone could stop her, she bolted from the room, heading for the door. But just as she reached the threshold, the air seemed to grow thick, and the door wouldn't open. The handle twisted in her hand, but it wouldn't budge. She screamed, pulling harder, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut from the other side. Inside, the family continued to sit, frozen. Grandma Edith's voice now echoed through the house, rhythmic and hypnotic, as though she were speaking in some forgotten tongue. Her hands were raised high above her head, as if she were summoning something. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A figure, dark and hunched, slowly emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs twisting in unnatural angles as it slithered forward. The air around it seemed to warp, and its face was obscured by shadows, but Emily could feel its eyes. Cold, empty, watching her. The scratching noise, too, was growing louder, as if the walls themselves were groaning under some unseen weight. "Mom! Dad!" Emily whispered in a panic, her hands pounding on the door, her voice barely audible. "Please, open the door." But the family remained in their seats, unmoving. Their eyes were glazed over, their hands still clasped in prayer. And at the table, beneath the dim light, there was a shadow, long and distorted, as though it had been cast from something not of this world. Emily took a step back, but she could not tear her eyes away from the table. Her stomach lurched, and for a moment, she could almost smell the stench of rotting meat. Something was waiting there. Something she didn't want to face, but something that had been calling her all along. And then, the whispered words from Grandma Edith's prayer came back to her. And for those who have forgotten their place at the table, in that moment, Emily realized with terrible clarity, she was the feast. It was a tradition in the Miller family to host Thanksgiving at the old farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills just outside of town. For as long as anyone could remember, the house had been passed down through generations, its creaky wooden floors and heavy oak beams steeped in history. This year, as always, the long dining table was set with fine china, the crystal goblets sparkling under the warm glow of the chandelier, and the smell of roasted turkey and freshly baked pies filled the air. But this Thanksgiving, something was different. Lena Miller stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged the food on the table. Her mother, Martha, was beside her, humming softly as she added the final touches to the mashed potatoes. Everything was perfect, too perfect. The turkey was golden brown and juicy. The stuffing had just the right balance of herbs, and the pumpkin pie was already cooling on the windowsill. Still, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt empty. Her father, William, had been acting strangely for weeks. He'd grown quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes constantly darting toward the shadows of the house, as though something were watching him. And her brother, Greg, hadn't been himself either. He'd come back home late the night before, looking pale and disheveled, as though he hadn't slept in days. He hadn't said a word since. "Mom," Lena said, glancing over at her mother, "do you think everything is all right this year? I mean, don't you think we've been feeling a little off lately?" Martha stopped humming and gave Lena a long, curious look. "Oh, sweetheart, it's just the stress of the season. You know how your father gets." She smiled, but it was thin, forced. "Nothing to worry about. We're going to have a wonderful Thanksgiving, just like always." But Lena wasn't so sure. There was a strange tension in the air, an unease that seemed to cling to the very walls of the farmhouse, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The guests started arriving around 4 p.m. Uncle Ray and Aunt Linda came first, then cousins Jason and Emily, who were always more excited about the dessert than the actual meal. The chatter around the house was warm and familiar, and for a while, the unease that had plagued Lena's thoughts seemed to dissipate. Her father, William, was in the living room, sipping whiskey and telling stories to the guests, but his face was drawn, his movements slow and stiff. It was as though he was here, but not here, all at once. the family finally gathered around the table. The candles flickered in the dim light, casting long shadows that stretched across the room, like fingers reaching out. Everyone took their seats, murmuring their thanks, but there was a noticeable silence. No one spoke too much, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. Lena sat next to her brother, Greg, who hadn't said a word all evening. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and his hands trembled as he reached for his glass of wine. His fingers brushed against hers, cold as ice. "You okay?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of silverware. Greg didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, he turned to her, his eyes wide and distant. I didn't want to come here tonight," he said quietly, his voice strained. "I didn't want to eat with them. Not after what we did. What they made me do." Lena frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Greg swallowed hard, his throat tightening as though he couldn't speak the words. But he didn't have to. The air around them suddenly felt heavier, as if the room had dropped several degrees in temperature. The low hum of conversation around the table faded, and Lena noticed her father's gaze had shifted to her, his eyes dark, hollow, his expression unreadable. "Greg, what's wrong?" Lena pressed, her voice growing louder now. Greg opened his mouth, as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward the door, and suddenly, the room fell completely silent. It was then that Lena realized what had changed. The food on the table was no longer just food. There was something wrong about it. The turkey's skin had a strange, unnatural sheen, and the mashed potatoes seemed too white, almost too perfect, as if they were molded from something other than food. The cranberry sauce, thick and glistening, had a deep, almost too red hue, and there was something pulsing beneath it. She recoiled, her stomach turning. "I don't want to eat this," she said, her voice trembling. But her father, William, was already standing, his hands clapping together sharply. "Let us pray," he said, his voice low and deep, his tone far too formal for the occasion. There was something in the way he said it that made Lena's blood run cold. The family members around the table bowed their heads, but Lena remained frozen in her chair, staring at the grotesque feast before her. Her eyes flickered to Greg, whose face had gone even more ashen, his lips moving in silent prayer. He looked as though he were about to cry. "Mom? What's happening?" Lena whispered, but her mother didn't respond. Instead, Martha, with a blank expression, raised her head and began to speak, her voice hollow, as though it wasn't really hers at all. "We give thanks for what we have. We give thanks for what we shall receive." Lena felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. What was going on? Why did her mother sound so empty? Her stomach churned in protest, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. "We give thanks," Martha continued, "for those who have come to share the meal, for those who have brought life, and for those who will return to us." Lena felt the weight of her mother's words like a suffocating force. The meal was not a gift. It was an offering, and they had all been drawn into it, trapped by some ancient and horrible custom. Her father's voice joined in, joining with Martha's in an eerie, unified chant. "We give thanks to those who have been reborn." Suddenly, the door creaked open. Lena's eyes darted toward it. A figure stood there in the threshold, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and as it stepped into the room, Lena saw that its face was obscured by shadows. The only thing visible were its eyes, wide, unblinking, dead. "We give thanks," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping, breathless sound, "for those who have been reborn, and for the one who has come back to join us." Lena's blood ran cold as the figure moved toward the table, its footsteps soundless on the wooden floor. It was then that she saw it, the body. The turkey on the table, once golden brown, now seemed to shimmer with a dark liquid. As she stared, she saw the truth. The meat was no longer meat at all. It was flesh. Her father's hand reached out, steady and deliberate, and he began carving the flesh with the same precision of a butcher preparing a sacrifice. "It's time," he whispered, his voice now thick with something unnatural. "Time to share the meal." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the figure moved toward her. She tried to scream, to run, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. And then, before her eyes, her father placed a thick slice of the flesh onto her plate. "We give thanks," he said, his eyes glinting with something dark, "for those who have come to join us. Welcome home, Lena." The truth hit her in a wave of horror. The feast was not for celebration. It was for something far more sinister, and she was the main course. It was a crisp Thanksgiving evening in the small town of Hollow Creek, where the locals had gathered for the annual feast. The town was known for its old traditions. Each year, families would share a meal, tell stories, and reflect on their blessings. But this year, something felt off. It began with the mysterious disappearance of Ruth Madison, an elderly woman who had never missed a Thanksgiving dinner. She lived alone in a dilapidated farmhouse at the edge of town, whispered about, but rarely visited. When the dinner bell rang, Ruth was nowhere to be found. She must have gotten lost, someone suggested, but no one really believed that. The route was familiar, and Ruth always found her way. Hours passed, and the meal continued without her. The turkey was carved, the mashed potatoes served, but an uneasy tension hung in the air. As midnight approached, the guests, half drunk from wine and pies, were startled by a loud crack from the hallway. Sheriff Tom Harris stood up, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice trembling. Then came the sound again, a series of rhythmic thuds, followed by a dragging noise. The room went silent as the door creaked open. Ruth Madison stood in the doorway. She was different. Her clothes torn, hair matted with dark clumps, eyes wide and staring, and the smell, the overwhelming scent of earth and decay. "Ruth," Sheriff Harris whispered, taking a cautious step forward. Ruth tilted her head, a grimace on her face. They're hungry," she rasped. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, and her hands were covered in dirt. She staggered toward the table, crawling onto it, tearing into the turkey with her bare hands. The guests recoiled, horrified, as she devoured it like a wild animal. "Step away from the table, Ruth," Sheriff Harris shouted, pulling his gun. But Ruth didn't respond. Instead, the floor began to tremble. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. Pale, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and stretched skin. They moved like Ruth, unnaturally jerking forward. "They're coming," Ruth mumbled, blood dripping from her chin. "Every year, for the harvest." The air grew cold as the figures advanced, and the guests realized too late. They weren't just celebrating Thanksgiving. They were part of an ancient ritual. As the townspeople fled, they heard the chilling cries of those who stayed behind. By morning, the town was empty, save for Ruth and the others who would feast on the living, continuing the cycle of hunger and death that had plagued Hollow Creek for generations. And every year, the harvest would return. But this time, the nightmares would come for anyone who dared to sit at the table